Today, we're breaking down 7 of the most underrated performances in film history, roles that deserve more credit, more recognition, and in some cases, outright awards. Let's get into it. Michael Fassbender as Bobby Sands, Hunger, 2008. First up on our list is Michael Fassbender's portrayal of Bobby Sands in the 2008 movie Hunger. When people talk about Hunger, they almost always talk about the weight loss, the transformation, the photos, the headlines, and yes, Fassbender's physical commitment is astonishing, but the irony is that the thing we remember most is the part of the performance that's actually the least interesting. The real power of his Bobby Sands isn't the physical collapse. It's the psychological unraveling happening in silence, in stillness, in the spaces between breaths. Take the 17-minute static shot conversation between Sands and the priest. It's one of the greatest acting sequences of the 21st century and still somehow not discussed enough. No cuts, no music, no tricks. Just two men arguing about morality, sacrifice, ego, and death. As you can see here, Fassbender plays the scene like a man who already knows he's gone. There's a calmness in him that's more terrifying than anger, a righteousness that feels earned rather than performed. The industry often rewards big acting, crying, screaming, monologues. But here, Fassbender does the opposite. He burns quietly, and it scorches the viewer. And that's a major reason the performance remains underrated. Hunger is minimalist, almost aggressively raw. It refuses emotional manipulation. It doesn't give audiences Oscar moments. Instead, it gives them silence and endurance. Films like that rarely stand a chance during awards season. Fassbender's work is too internal, too spiritual, and too unadorned for the kinds of campaigns that win trophies. Because subtle heartbreak, the kind you can't GIF, can't clip, can't easily describe, never competes well against performances built around transformation, theatrics, or narrative hype. Fassbender gave one of the most committed performances of the decade, and yet Hollywood mostly remembers it as the movie where he starved himself. That's the definition of underrated. And as we move into the next performance, this theme of overshadowing is about to intensify, because our next performance wasn't buried by minimalism or indie obscurity. It was buried by something even bigger, one of the most iconic performances of the modern era. Next is Aaron Eckhart as Harvey Dent and Two-Face in the 2008 superhero classic, The Dark Knight. There's an argument, a strong one, that the emotional core of The Dark Knight doesn't belong to Batman or Gotham or even the Joker. It belongs to Harvey Dent. And the fact that this idea still catches people off guard is exactly why Aaron Eckhart's performance is one of the most underrated in modern blockbuster cinema. Ledger's Joker became a cultural event, a cinematic earthquake so massive that everything around it got swallowed whole. But beneath that chaos, Eckhart was doing something quieter, more human, and absolutely essential. Dent carries the film's moral stakes on his shoulders. His story is the tragedy The Dark Knight actually hinges on, the rise and destruction of the one man who could have saved Gotham the right way. And Eckhart plays that arc with a level of earnestness and sincerity that's almost old-fashioned. He starts as an icon of hope, radiating a kind of moral clarity that isn't naive. It's necessary. Gotham needs him to be pure. So does the audience. And that's what makes his fall hurt. The shift from noble idealist to broken, vengeful force isn't played for melodrama. Eckhart grounds it in shock, grief, and a kind of hollowed out rage. He doesn't become a comic book villain, he becomes a man who lost everything and then lost himself. In a film defined by big performances and grand philosophical statements, Eckhart gives tragedy the weight of something painfully real. The irony is that this is the exact kind of subtle, internalized work that tends to get overshadowed, just like what happened to Fassbender in Hunger. Earlier on, we talked about how physical transformation overshadowed emotional depth. Here it's the opposite problem, emotional depth overshadowed by someone else's transformation. Ledger deserved every ounce of praise he received, but his brilliance shouldn't erase the precision and heartbreak in Eckhart's descent. And if eclipsed performances are the pattern so far, the next performance on the list is going to take this idea to a new level. Because our next actor wasn't overshadowed by a co-star, but by the entire cultural memory of a film that people think they've already figured out. Number 3 on our list is Joaquin Phoenix as Commodus in Gladiator. There are villains you fear, and then there are villains you understand against your will. Joaquin Phoenix's Commodus sits in that rare second category, a performance built on insecurity, fragility, emotional hunger, and cruelty that feels disturbingly human. In Gladiator, he isn't the operatic tyrant audiences were expecting. He's something far more unsettling, pathetic and dangerous at the same time. A boy in a man's body begging to be loved and destroying anything that won't give him that love unconditionally. Phoenix plays Commodus with a level of psychological detail that blockbuster villains rarely get. The trembling voice, the watery eyes, the breathy, almost childlike way he expresses affection. All of it adds to a portrait of a man whose power doesn't make him strong. It magnifies his weakness. It is a terrifying performance because it's so grounded. Commodus isn't a monster. He's a needy, broken human with absolute authority, which is infinitely scarier. And yet, his work was never given its rightful place. The film's cultural memory calcified around Russell Crowe's stoic physicality, the massive battles, and the classic revenge arc. Crowe took home the Oscar. The spectacle took the spotlight, and Phoenix's devastating character study was treated like an accessory, as if the emotional tension of the entire movie didn't depend on him cracking apart on screen. It mirrors what we've already seen in earlier milestones. Fassbender's depth and hunger was overshadowed by the physical transformation people fixated on. Eckhart's tragedy in The Dark Knight disappeared beneath Ledger's cultural explosion. And Phoenix, he got buried under scale, not by another actor's performance, but by the immensity of the film around him. In all three cases, brilliant internal performances were treated as if they were just lucky to be invited. But here's the twist. Although his early masterwork never received its proper re-evaluation, Phoenix would eventually become known as one of the greatest actors of his generation and get an Oscar for another iconic role. Can you guess the role? And if being overshadowed by spectacle is becoming a pattern, our next performance takes that idea and flips it. A legendary actor delivering one of his most nuanced roles in a movie hardly anyone talks about anymore. Gary Oldman as Jackie Flannery, State of Grace, 1990. Up next is a familiar face on this channel, Gary Oldman. Here we talk about him as Jackie Flannery in the 1990 American neo-noir crime drama State of Grace. Every generation has an actor who can play unhinged without ever losing the human being underneath the madness. In 1990, that actor was Gary Oldman, and his work as Jackie Flannery in State of Grace is one of the clearest examples of just how fearless, emotional, and electrically unpredictable he was at the height of his raw powers. Jackie is chaos incarnate, a man who loves too hard, drinks too much, and protects the people in his orbit with a loyalty so violent it becomes tragic. Oldman doesn't play him as a gangster stereotype, he plays him as a wounded animal, desperately clinging to a sense of belonging. You can see heartbreak flicker through the bravado, fear ripple under the swagger, sadness leak through the drunken laughter. The performance is volcanic, but it's also tender. It's one of the few roles where Oldman lets the emotional seams show without theatrical armor. And yet, almost nobody talks about it. The fault for that isn't on Gary or even State of Grace. The fault lies in the fact that State of Grace was released the same year as Goodfellas, which sucked all the oxygen out of the gangster genre. Scorsese's masterpiece became the defining crime film of 1990, and everything around it got reduced to footnotes. That cultural eclipse is why Jackie Flannery isn't a widely referenced character today, despite being one of Oldman's most open-veined performances. Which brings us to the contrast with the Oldman we discussed in the last video on overrated performances, his Winston Churchill in Darkest Hour. There, the industry celebrated prosthetics, imitation, and the broad strokes of a historical icon. It was Oldman at his most polished and external. Jackie Flannery is the opposite. No prosthetics, no mimicry, no Oscar-friendly speeches, just an actor running at full emotional tilt, showing more soul in a drunken monologue than any award night transformation makeup can provide. And it ties directly to the pattern we've seen in this video so far. Fassbender's psychological depth is ignored in favor of physical suffering. Eckhart buried beneath a co-star's iconic storm. Phoenix overshadowed by the scale of his own movie. And Oldman, here, he's overshadowed by timing. Not another actor, not a bigger performance, but a cultural giant that swallowed everything in its wake. Now that we've hit volcanic chaos, our next actor slows everything down. A performance built on quiet devastation, subtle fractures, and the kind of emotional restraint that can be more brutal than any on-screen explosion. And by the way, if you haven't seen our 7 most overrated performances in film history, check it out on our channel. In number 5, we have Donald Sutherland as Calvin Jarrett in the 1980 American drama film Ordinary People. Here we see a performance that didn't shout, break things, collapse into tears, or demand attention through theatrics. Instead, we see a performance that sits quietly in the corner of the frame and lets you feel a person slowly cracking from the inside out. And Donald Sutherland as Calvin Jarrett in Ordinary People is exactly that. A portrayal so inward, so humane, and so emotionally transparent that it almost disappears by design. And unfortunately, it disappeared from awards conversations as well. Everyone remembers Timothy Hutton's breakthrough. Everyone remembers Mary Tyler Moore's icy brilliance, but Sutherland gives the film its moral stability and ultimately its devastating collapse. Calvin is the character who feels the full gravitational pull of the family's grief without ever having a scene that announces, "This is my Oscar clip." He listens, he absorbs, he tries to hold everyone else together while quietly losing the ability to hold himself together anymore. That's not subtlety as a limitation, that's subtlety as a weapon. And what makes the performance so heartbreaking is how Sutherland communicates a crisis of identity without saying it outright. His smiles get thinner, his posture tightens, his voice softens not from calmness, but from exhaustion. The exhaustion of a man realizing he can't save the two people he loves most from themselves. By the time the film reaches its emotional endpoint, it becomes clear that Calvin's quiet unraveling is the most tragic part of the story. Hutton gives the catharsis, Moore gives the cold shock, Sutherland gives the truth, yet he received 0 award nominations. Not one. And this isn't the first time a performance in our list gets overlooked because it isn't loud enough to compete with chaos or spectacle. Sutherland's Calvin suffers the most delicate version of that same fate, overshadowed simply because his character refuses to perform his pain outwardly. But that's what makes it one of the most underrated turns of its era. A portrait of a man grieving so softly that audiences almost miss how deeply he's hurting. And from emotional quietude, we now swing to a performance built on volatility, intimacy, and raw interpersonal collapse. One that modern audiences still revisit because of how brutally real it feels. Michelle Williams as Cindy, or Blue Valentine, 2010. Next up is a performance that feels too real to be acting. There are performances that impress you, and then there are performances that make you feel like you shouldn't be watching. Michelle Williams in Blue Valentine belongs to the second category. Her work as Cindy is so raw, so exposed, and so lived in that it almost stops functioning as acting. It becomes something closer to documentary truth, the kind of emotional realism that doesn't get studied so much as it gets absorbed. Williams doesn't play Cindy, she inhabits her, the insecurities, the quiet disappointments, the desperate hope that keeps flickering even as the relationship decays. All of it is rendered with microscopic detail. There's no big monologue announcing heartbreak, no loudly performed breakdown engineered for award season clips. Instead, Williams builds a portrait of a woman who's been slowly eroded by years of emotional attrition. It's the sort of performance that makes you uncomfortable for the same reason great writing makes you uncomfortable. It sounds and feels real. But realism comes with a strange curse. Ryan Gosling's performance, brilliant in its own right, is bigger. His pain is louder, more externally visible, and easier to isolate as an acting moment. Williams, meanwhile, plays the kind of emotional endurance that women are expected to shoulder quietly. Because of that, many viewers mislabeled Cindy as less sympathetic or less dynamic, when really the performance is doing something far more intricate, showing how someone can break in silence. Awards bodies didn't know what to do with this kind of work. It's not glamorous, it's not traditionally difficult, it's not technically showy, it's the kind of acting that disappears into the seams of the film, and because it feels so authentic, it paradoxically becomes harder for voters to appreciate as a craft. They reacted to the film's emotional weight, but not necessarily to the precision that created it. And this brings us back to Fassbender in Hunger. Different styles, same problem. Fassbender's minimalism and physical commitment were so stark and severe that many people reduced the performance to weight loss, just as many reduced Williams's work to realistic relationship drama. In both cases, the internal nuance, the psychological detail was overshadowed by the film's reputation for intensity. And now we move to our final performance, which features an actor whose entire career embodies subtlety, restraint, and the art of doing more by doing less, perhaps the greatest underrated star the 70s ever produced. Roy Scheider as Chief Martin Brody, Jaws, 1975. The last performance on the list happens before CGI spectacles and multi-billion-dollar franchises. It happens in Jaws, a film that shouldn't have worked half as well as it did. Production issues were numerous, the mechanical shark broke constantly. Spielberg was a kid directing beyond his experience, and the production itself was chaos. But the reason the movie remains one of the most suspenseful films ever made isn't the shark, it's Roy Scheider. His role as Chief Martin Brody is the emotional spine that holds the film together, and yet he received 0 awards attention for it. And honestly, that might be one of the biggest oversights of the era. Scheider plays Brody with a level of restraint almost unheard of in a blockbuster lead. He's not a swaggering hero, not a tough guy, not a mythic warrior. He's an ordinary man, and that's exactly why the film works. His fear is quiet. His courage is reluctant. His leadership doesn't come from bravado, but from responsibility. You believe every moment of his dread because Scheider grounds it in something painfully human. The feeling of being completely out of your depth, but stepping forward anyway. In a movie defined by spectacle, Scheider chooses subtlety, and that subtlety is what gives the film its heart. It's easy to forget how much of Jaws is carried by his reactions. The way he scans the water with growing unease, the tension in his body as he sits on the beach pretending everything is fine, the whispered line,
"You're gonna need a bigger boat,"
is delivered not as a joke, but as a man who realizes he's come face to face with something far beyond him. That moment is iconic because it's honest, not performative. But Brody's brilliance becomes even clearer when you look at Scheider's career as a whole. This is the same actor who gave blistering intensity in The French Connection, heartbreaking vulnerability in All That Jazz, and raw physical presence in Sorcerer. He had range, depth, and an instinct for understatement that made other actors look theatrical by comparison. Yet he was nearly always overshadowed by sharks, by co-stars, by spectacle. And in that sense, he shares DNA with Aaron Eckhart's Harvey Dent from The Dark Knight. Both men played the moral centers of their films. Both delivered the grounded performances that gave their stories emotional weight, and both were overshadowed by flashier elements. A killer shark in one case, an instantly iconic villain in the other. Scheider was the calm in the chaos, and that calm is what made Jaws a masterpiece. And we believe he deserved far more recognition for it. These 7 performances aren't hidden gems. They're top-tier acting works that simply never had the awards momentum or cultural machinery behind them. Each one was overshadowed by something bigger. A louder co-star, a flashier villain, a groundbreaking spectacle, a prestige bias, or the politics of award season. And yet, without these performances, their films wouldn't function. They're the emotional anchors, the moral centers, the psychological core. Across all these performances, one pattern becomes clear. Subtlety rarely wins headlines, and emotional precision doesn't always fit into an awards narrative. That's the same dynamic we explored in the previous video on the 7 most overrated performances in film history, but from the opposite angle, how hype, not quality, shapes legacy. If you are curious about the 7 most overrated performances in film history video, click the video on your screen. Also, if there are performances you believe deserved far more recognition, drop them in the comments. And if you enjoyed the breakdown, like and subscribe for more videos like this.